All right, so good morning. My name is Oscar Dubon. I'm Vice Chancellor for Equity and Inclusion, and I wish to welcome our students, our community partners, our faculty, our staff, our campus colleagues for taking the time to be here for this wonderful event. I am truly delighted to open this event, Toward Equity in Policy and Pedagogy, which is hosted by the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society, HIFIS. The Haas Institute is Cal's hub of engaged scholars, researchers, strategic communicators, policymakers, and community partners who are working to identify and eliminate the barriers to an inclusive, just, and sustainable society. They offer cutting-edge research and toolkits that respond to our most pressing issues. The work that you will hear today is rooted in current critical issues related to inequality, social inclusion, and democracy. It is framed and informed by real-world applicability in policy, advocacy, pedagogical tools, and strategies about integrating equity and inclusion in practice. At this time, I wish to call up Professor John Powell, Director of the HIFIS. John is a highly regarded thought leader in these areas and really has been a critical and important voice addressing the issues that have come upon our nation, and really has been, it's really important to have John, has been really important to have John because Berkeley is called to weigh in on these issues. And to have John here provide that critical voice and that critical vision around so many issues has been really instrumental, not just for the nation, but also for our own community here at Cal, because all those national issues do impact our own communities. So I am really privileged to welcome John to the podium.
Kind of awkward getting to this short podium. So first I'd like to just acknowledge that we're on Alani land, and as is much of Northern California, and want to give acknowledgement to that and my respect to the Alani Nation. So we just have like 30 seconds of silence and respect for that. Thank you. Well, thank all of you for coming out. And first of all, I just want to acknowledge Oscar. Oscar has been a great partner in this endeavor. He stepped into the position, and I must say, sort of interesting being here in many ways. Some of you may not know, and I only have a few minutes, so I won't take you through a long, contorted story. But I was about to go to another university, University of UT Austin, and I got a call from my daughter saying, "You can't do that. You have a granddaughter here in the Bay Area." And I said, "But I don't have a job in the Bay Area." And then I got a call from Michael Omi and about this position. And one of the conditions I said is that I would, if it made sense and I got the position, I'd only do it if Michael would be my associate director at the Haas Institute. So Michael was the first associate director, and I felt like, first, I've known Michael forever, and also he knows the university, he knows the system. So I thought it would be a great partnership. And it was. And some difficulty just getting things started, trying to get hires. And then Michael had some medical issues and just being tired, which I think a lot of us can relate to. He decided to stay involved, but to step down as associate director. And I was pretty distraught. And then up stepped Teku, and it's like my distraught went away. And Teku came, I set up an interesting time. We were just finishing the hiring, most of the hiring, and Teku really focused on really getting the research and pushing it out. And part of what you see is Teku's efforts in terms of the briefs, working with the clusters to get the briefs really done. And they're just beautiful. And I want to thank all of the cluster members and the cluster leaders who participated in those briefs. They're really quite amazing. But then, as life would have it, Teku decided that he was moving on. I was starting to get really distraught again. And then up stepped Denise. And man, it's like, you know, my father's a Christian minister. He would say, God is great. It's like, those of you who don't, Denise, you know, you do yourself a favor and get to know her. She's in public health. She's been at Berkeley for many years. She was at the very inception of thinking about HIFAS before it was HIFAS. She's a leader on the campus, a wonderful thought partner, and just really a great person to work with. So even though Teku and Michael have shifted gears, we're still humming. Also, I want to give a special thank out to the Haas Junior Fund, which none of this would have happened without their vision, their leadership, and their money. And I want to give a special thank out to Kathy Chai, which I think is here. Including they're pushing us to sort of get more stuff out, including these briefs you're going to see. As one person said, the briefs are really beautiful, but they're not so brief. Yeah, but we're dealing with really critical issues, as Oscar said. They're real issues that affect real people, and the world is changing very fast. And I think this cutting edge of interdisciplinary research that's associated with practice, organized by some of the best scholars in the world, it couldn't happen at a more critical time. I also want to just thank the Haas staff and I work with them every day. They make this possible. They're sort of the backbones behind the scene, and you may not see them, but you actually feel their impact. So I just want to acknowledge them as well. And then finally, there's always this tension between scholarship, between interdisciplinary scholarship and practice. I was at The Ohio State University running a different institute, and I remember talking to one of the heads of an area and about linking scholarship and practice, and they said it doesn't work. You can't do that. Policy and scholarship doesn't go together. And I said, this is a big university, and so we can have different opinions, but that's what I'm about. And one of the things we launched was bringing together the mind science, stuff around implicit bias, anxiety, and pushing that out of the academy into the world. And once that exploded, one of the provosts of the Ohio State University came to me and said, why aren't you working with the faculty here? Because I was working with the faculty at Harvard and at Washington, University of Washington, but not at my own university. And I said, I'm happy to. And I went back to that same person again, and we started working together. So to me, it's sort of really important that Berkeley's on the forefront of this. It's not resistant to it. It's actually stepping into it. And you're going to have a chance to see some of the best work, some of the best scholars doing that work. So I'm going to get out of the way and hand it over to them. So again, thank all of you for coming, and thank the Haas staff and the leaders for the work you've done.
Thank you so much, John. I didn't know that we both had in common that we were raised by Christian ministers. So you learn something new every day, and I would say being here today is a blessing, and I'm just really delighted to be here. I think this event represents so much because, as John mentioned, I've been associated with this initiative before, while it was in the planning stages. And I remember the days that Gabor Basri and Alice Agagino, she's an engineer, they were doing town hall meetings with faculty and staff and students at Berkeley, working on an issue that we're still working with, and that is climate, especially for underrepresented minority students. And they thought that one of the keys to advancing the climate, improving the climate, was to diversify the faculty. So the initial initiative under Chancellor Birgeneau had that goal, and that was to diversify the faculty and to improve our climate here. And so under Chancellor Birgeneau's direction, the new initiative began to take shape. And the goal was not only to diversify the faculty, but it was also to make Berkeley a centerpiece of this kind of scholarship, and that would be nationally and in fact globally recognized. And so when I see an event like today where the initiative has blossomed to the point that not only have we recruited just an amazing group of scholars, and Berkeley is known for having rock stars, and the people that we have been able to hire through this initiative, which includes, I think we probably have 10 or 11 people, in faculty positions now. They represent some of the highest caliber of people that you're going to find at any university. We've recruited them from places like Harvard, from just high-ranking institutions. But I think what really moves me about them is that they are all deeply committed to scholarship, excellent scholarship that advances the cause and the mission around justice and equity and a fair and democratic society. So the other thing about them is we have superstars, but they're not lone people working in their silos. They are working in collaboratives with other faculty. The cluster system that was a part of this model, from what I can see, is pretty unique across the country. So our faculty that were hired are working with faculty in 7 different clusters. They lead clusters, and these clusters have about over 90 faculty that they're engaged in. So we have this collaboration of folks across the campus, and it's a network. I mean, in a time when we feel like democracy is threatened, it's a network for continuing democracy and justice and equity. And so instead of being like individual rock stars, we've got a constellation of people networking across campus, working in this area. And as John said, they're not just doing scholarship. Scholarship is incredibly important, but they're also engaging in communities. They're engaging with the issues of our time, and they've been selected to be leaders. Leadership and policy advocacy are some of the characteristics that we've looked for when we've hired them. So we have a great group of faculty. We have a great group of people collaborating together. And today is an occasion in which we're going to celebrate, we're kicking off a year in democracy and equity. I mean, I think we need that frame. And we're going to get a glimpse of the research that are happening in the clusters, and we're also going to acknowledge and really celebrate the launching of the policy briefs that are coming out of the issues that these clusters have been working on for quite a while. And as you'll see, as the program unfolds, the clusters have been addressing some of the core issues that create barriers to equity in our society: racial injustice, segregation, antipathy towards LGBT and disabled people, poverty, and educational inequality. Those are some of the issues that the clusters have been working on and which these briefs reflect. So our format today is we're going to have 2 panels. And the first panel will be talking about the research interest and activities of the clusters. And the second one will focus on the briefs. So I just wanted to give you a little overview of what our format is going to be. So we'll have the panel 1 and panel 2, and then we will have time for dialogue and for Q&A and interaction with the audience. So to facilitate our Q&A, we'll have, I think index cards will be being circulated, and so as the panelists are speaking, if you'd please write your questions down, they'll be collected and synthesized in time for our Q&A. So let's see, where am I? So now I'm really pleased to introduce our panelists, and as as John mentioned, I also wanted to acknowledge Taeku Lee, who helped, as John described, who's been really instrumental in working with the cluster and cluster faculty for the past 2 years, and he worked very closely with faculty around the development of these briefs. He'll be speaking on the second panel. So I'm going to briefly introduce our panel members. They have extensive bios and accomplishments, and I hope that you read about them on the Haas website. So I'm just going to introduce them very briefly with respect to their role with the clusters. So first we have Osagie Obasogie, and Osagie is chair of Diversity and Health Disparities Cluster, and he's professor of bioethics in the Joint Medical Program and School of Public Health. Karen Barkey is the chair of the Religious Diversity Cluster and a professor of sociology. Janelle Scott is chair of the Diversity and Educational Policy Cluster and professor in Education and African American Studies. Sabelle Fox is the acting chair of the Diversity and Democracy Cluster and professor of sociology. Sonia Keitel is chair of LGBT Citizenship Cluster and the Chancellor's professor of law. And Karen Nakamura is the chair of the Disability Study Cluster and professor of anthropology. And Jovan Lewis is a Haas assistant professor and undergraduate faculty advisor for human geography. So at this time, I'm going to ask the panelists their first question, and they'll each have a few minutes to respond to the question. So the first question for each panel member is, what contributions does your cluster make to the campus faculty research initiative on diversity and social equity? Did everybody get that, or should I say it, repeat it again? Okay, so we'll take the panelists, and you'll have 2 or 3 minutes, and there's a timekeeper there that is going to remind you of when you need to stop.
So we tend to think of health as something that is fixed by our genes. You know, we pour millions of dollars each year into genetic research to try and figure out which genes or set of genes correlate with particular health outcomes. But genes are only part of the picture. So researchers estimate that less than 20% of deaths from chronic disease can be attributed to our genetics. So at the Health Disparities Cluster, we see our work as exploring this other 80%. The cluster brings together faculty from departments across campus to think about and explore the role that social, economic, legal, and political factors play in creating disparities regarding who gets to live healthy and productive lives and who dies prematurely. It turns out that the more advantaged our lives are, the longer we live and the healthier we are from birth to old age. This is what we call the social determinants of health. That is, that one's social position strongly correlates and predicts with health status. This social determinants position creates an enormous opportunity. We don't need fancy new genetic technologies to make the world a better and safer place. And you don't have to win the genetic lottery to live a long and healthy life. Rather, research shows that if we can create more social and economic opportunities for people across race, gender, and class lines, we can create a healthier and more sustainable future for everyone. So therefore, the Health Disparities Cluster creates partnerships across campus with our community stakeholders here in California and with folks across the globe to figure out which type of interventions can be developed to improve population health. And this contributes significantly to increasing diversity and social equity. Living long and healthy lives is not something that should only be accessible to those who are wealthy. Our cluster is working to democratize health and to institutionalize healthy outcomes so that the happenstance of where you are born does not dictate the ability to live a good life. In a few minutes, my colleague Mahasan Mujahid will discuss our cluster's policy brief, The Sick Side of Town, which talks about how place and neighborhoods shapes health outcomes. We're very proud of this brief and the phenomenal research by our cluster members that it describes. Our cluster faculty are out there in the world making tremendous interventions that focus on how how social and environmental changes can improve the lives of the most disadvantaged. We see this as fulfilling a key aspect of the Haas Institute's initiative on diversity and social equity, and with your continued support, we can continue to do this work for many years to come. Thank you. No, it's on.
It's on. Hi, hello. First, I just actually want to thank everybody who contributed to this event because it just is an incredible accomplishment. So thank you, everyone. Second, I want to actually start by introducing my new colleague who is sitting right there, Ronit Stahl, who is the new assistant professor at the Haas Religious Diversity Cluster and in the History Department. Her work enlisting faith, how the military chaplaincy shaped religion and state in modern America is really actually extraordinary, and I think you should all look at it. It looks at how the chaplaincy developed in the military and how it grew to influence American society and American issues of religion from World War I to the 1980s. So it really fits the cluster, and it's very important. Okay, the religious diversity cluster really interrogates the role of religion in public life, especially with issues with regard to issues relating to religious diversity, religious pluralism, toleration, coexistence. How do religious groups come to coexist, come to live together in peace without hatred? So comprised of a very, very diverse and multidisciplinary group of scholars engaged especially in comparative, in historical studies, to understand the role of religion, the role of religious pluralism across time, across political contexts, in the past and in the contemporary world, in the Western and non-Western areas of the world, in order to create a kind of established set of tools to understand the way in which religious pluralism works. So if you take the concept of religious pluralism, we ask the question of how is it that political and social institutions contribute, work to create religious pluralism, and then we turn the question around and we think, how is it that religious pluralism affects institutions? What does it do to institutions? How does it improve the working of institutions? So those are our two questions, in a sense. That's what motivates us, okay? And then we actually have, and I think this is something I love about our cluster, is that we all have an incredible diversity of projects that we actually carry partly on our own and with our students and within our departments, and then we have a collective cluster enterprise that really also brings all these questions together. So I won't talk about individual projects because I don't have time, but collectively the big project, and in fact this afternoon we're all getting together to start writing a grant on this, is we're starting to think about how the religious pluralism, democracy, liberalism work together, how they don't work together, how they do work together, and how do we interrogate each of these concepts to figure out ways to come up with solutions. As you know, there's a lot of critiques of democracy, a lot of critiques of liberalism out there for not including religion and this and that. We don't want, it's not, in a sense, we want to go further. We want to figure out alternative ways of thinking about these concepts and come up with policy initiatives based on that. And I will finish by saying that I want to thank and I want to introduce now Grace Goodis, who will take this space because she's the graduate student in history, 4th year, who actually worked with me on the American religious diversity policy brief that we did. She will explain it. She's been central to keeping our cluster together and the role of not only faculty, but of our graduate students in this institution. We have stellar graduate students, and they are fantastic, and we need to include them into our clusters, and I think she will do the job next. So thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Hi, I'm Janelle Scott. I chair the Race, Diversity, and Education Policy Cluster. Thank you all for being here. Look forward to our conversation today. You know, I realized this morning that I've been talking too much to my husband about this event when I was talking about the clusters, and my 11-year-old this morning said, "So the clusters like cereal, like they come together?" Yeah, they're kind of like cereal, I think. Cereal is delicious. So our cereal in the cluster is comprised by Patricia Baquedano Lopez, Tina Trujillo, Jabari Mahiri, Chris Gutierrez, Michael Dumas, Mark Brilliant, Rucker Johnson, Christopher Edley, Lisa Garcia Bedoya, and Zeus Leonardo. And I think at the core of our cluster, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention Nayela Nasir, who was formerly with our cluster, is now president of the Spencer Foundation. And I think Nayela and I were unique in that we were hired together in our search, and both of us were Berkeley alumni as well. So we sort of came home for this initiative, and it's been wonderful celebrating my 10-year anniversary this month of coming back to Cal. So at the core of our cluster is some assumptions around research, that research matters, that applied work matters, that partnerships matter. We're focused largely on policy and practice and pedagogy related to educational justice. In terms of what we have been doing, I think we've been doing quite a bit. Our faculty, both individually and collectively, are all over the place on campus, and so from the Kerner Commission event last year, where Rucker Johnson's research on segregation was presented. Tina Trujillo and I co-authored a report on discipline policies in schools and how they disproportionately affect students of color from the National Education Policy Center in Boulder, Colorado. We've also collaborated on some work on a study of Teach for America. There's been ongoing research in the Oakland Unified School District by members of our cluster. Tina Trujillo, John Powell, and Nayela Nasir have been involved in that, along with a host of graduate students. And we've also run an active speaker series, bringing to campus scholars whose work is really advancing our thinking around race and educational disparity. And so people like Vanessa Siddle-Walker, Linda Darling-Hammond, William Perez, and Jamie Liu. This year, our series is going to focus specifically on education and segregation. So look for those announcements soon. And then finally, I just want to highlight, I think, something that's become we're very proud of it is the course. We developed a signature course for our cluster, a graduate level course called Research Advances in Race, Diversity, and Education Policy. I see a couple students in the room have taken that class. I'm teaching it this semester. It's a wonderful course, and I think what this course has done is really brought together what this initiative, in part, always hoped to be. We have students from all over campus who take this class. For example, this semester we have students from the Goldman School of Public Policy, the Graduate School of Education, African American Studies, Social Welfare, Psychology, Berkeley Law, and Computer Science in the class, and really learning together. And a core premise of this course is that we actually do a really good job in education policy research talking about race. We measure it, we measure gaps, but we don't talk about racism very much, and how these gaps show up in our processes, our pedagogies, and our policies. And so this course really helps us to think hard about what we mean by race, what assumptions drive our metrics, and what assumptions drive our interventions. And so, and I think the students that have gone on from this course have published some of the work they've written, but also have gone out into the field and really trying to change the world and make it a more just and inclusive place. So thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name's Sonia Katyal, and I chair the LGBTQ Citizenship Cluster. It's such an incredible honor for me to be here and to also just listen to the amazing work of the other clusters, and I look forward to working with all of you in your own projects. Our cluster, I think, is really one of the first of its kind in the country. One of the things that I think is particularly notable about our cluster, which focuses on LGBTQ issues, is that it reflects a really strong focus on gender or sexual minorities, but also situates a concern for that constituency within a host of other issues that also focus on class, gender, race, immigration, disability, increasingly incarceration as well. And so one of the things that I think is particularly awesome about the cluster is also our composition, which is we have a number of scholars that are legal scholars, but we also have a really rich reflection of all of the different ways in which LGBTQ identity intersects with other kinds of areas. So we have a number of faculty from ethnic studies, we have a faculty member from the French department, we have an anthropology scholar. And then we have a number of scholars who are also part of the cluster who are housed in gender and women's studies. And it adds, I think, a really rich and exciting source of conversation about focusing on LGBTQ issues within the scope of all of the different projects that individuals have been working on. And so in the past, the cluster has done some amazing things in terms of putting together really important critical conversations that focus on kind of critical discourse, but also situating them within this realm of a focus on kind of law and policy. So last year we had an event on Orlando that brought in a number of scholars to talk about what happened in Orlando, also within a scope of concern that focused on issues of immigration, issues of racial identity, but also issues that focused on the importance of the creation of safe spaces within the LGBTQ community. Earlier, there was another event that we had that focused on race and passing, both within the trans community as well as in a racial context. The former chair did a number of groundbreaking projects that brought in empirical research within the LGBTQ community. And this year, we're particularly excited that we have just hired Eric Stanley to join our cluster, who is a junior hire who works on transgender issues. And we're incredibly excited to see what Eric brings to our cluster. In terms of the future, we have a number of really exciting events planned. We hope to really actively partner with other clusters to talk about different intersections within the LGBTQ community with respect to housing, with respect to immigration, with respect to trans-related issues. We've had discussions about holding an event to both celebrate but also contemplate the future of sexual equality in India because of the recent 377 decision. We also hope to have kind of a retreat to sort of set a more active agenda for the future. And the idea behind all of these projects is to really support the visibility of integrating LGBT issues within policy, but also within all of these important and exciting discussions that happen throughout our campus. And part of this, I think, is also informed by the fact that so many members of our cluster also have a really critical view about the way in which law and policy has evolved across time. And that, I think, brings a really rich level of discussion to some of the issues that we focus on. Our members, I think, are really outstanding in the way in which they situate LGBTQ issues at the core of the work that they do, but also situating it within this sort of broader landscape that also focuses on other subjects as well. So in the future, I really hope that we can draw on our collective work that is being done within the cluster, such important work that's being done on disability, class, and gender, but to also, and other subjects, but to also balance a strong interest in these subjects within a larger landscape that focuses on law and policy, but also really celebrates the importance of critical discourse, which is such an important focus of all of us here at Berkeley. So thank you so much.
I'm Cybelle Fox, and I'm the acting chair of the Diversity and Democracy Cluster. The central focus of the D&D cluster, as we like to call it, is the question of how liberal democratic principles and practices adapt to an increasingly diverse population. Questions about citizenship and membership that flow from this agenda are both descriptive and normative, and they touch on the formation and fragmentation of the personal and communal identities by which we and they are created. They also touch on the disputes about categorization of groups and the allocation of rights and benefits to such groups, whether they're based on race or ethnicity, religion, national origin, or legal status. And they touch on the participation of all individuals and groups in civic and political life. The D&D cluster sponsors a variety of speakers and forums in collaboration with the Center for the Study of Race and Gender. We co-sponsored a talk last fall by Yale professor Alicia Schmidt Camacho. The talk examined how migrants insert their voices into debates about border governance and how they assert their rights in terms that contest the primacy of citizenship as the anchor for social belonging. In collaboration with the Health Disparities Cluster, we also co-sponsored the Equality Law Scholars Forum. This was a convening designed to showcase and mentor legal scholars who are junior faculty and who are working in the area of equality law. A number of senior faculty associated with the cluster participated in this event, including Bertrell Ross, Jonathan Simon, and former cluster chair Angela Onuachi-Willig. Last spring, cluster member Lisa Garcia-Bedoya gave an inspiring talk in the Research to Impact Faculty Colloquium series, where she was talking about some of her research on how to promote political engagement in communities where political participation has traditionally been low, especially Latinx communities. The cluster also invited Princeton political scientist Paul Freimer to speak. The talk that he gave drew on his most recent book, Building an American Empire, and he talked about the politics of American expansion, focusing on how the government's regulation of population movements on the frontier, both in terms of settlement and frontier removal policies, advanced national aspirations for empire and promoted the formation of a white settler nation. Now, in addition to the research described in the policy brief that you're going to hear more about shortly from Teku, cluster faculty have also published a variety of reports and scholarly articles that deal centrally with questions about diversity and democracy. Tide Senior Fellow Joshua Clark, in consultation with D&D cluster faculty, published a HIFIS report titled What Didn't Happen, which helps us to better understand the outcome of the 2016 presidential election. We also supported the launch of the SSRN Working Paper Series for the Berkeley Comparative Equality and Anti-Discrimination Law Study Group, which is a network of some 250 scholars, activists, and legal practitioners worldwide, which is led by David Oppenheimer, who's a new cluster member. And I'm told that we now have 99 working papers so far in this series. HIFIS also provided funding to support projects that are spearheaded by D&D affiliated faculty. One example of this is that HIFIS provided startup resources to launch the Berkeley Interdisciplinary Migration Initiative, or BIMI, which is directed by cluster affiliate Irene Blumrad. Bringing together research, training, and public engagement, BIMI aspires to inform, educate, and transform knowledge about migration. HIFIS helped to support an innovative mapping tool that BIMI is developing to show the spatial mismatch between where immigrants live and where services for them are located in the Bay Area. And their hope is to secure additional funding to develop an app that will allow immigrants to find legal and health clinics. HIFIS also partnered with BIMI to produce snapshots of campus research with an eye to policy relevance. A number of faculty members associated with our cluster, as well as the Economic Disparities Cluster, including Teku, Irene, Kim Voss, and Danny Schneider, have been working on a three-wave panel study of the dynamics of economic volatility and poverty in the Bay Area. And the sample that they're following includes a large number of immigrants, and among other things, this study will help us to better understand how immigrants are being incorporated into the Bay Area. The project is chiefly funded by Tipping Point, but HIFIS contributed critical supplemental funding for this project. And lastly, HIFIS also helped to launch a post-2016 election climate study of undocumented students on our campus. And this was led by Lisa Garcia-Bedoya and Letty Volpe, who's associated with the LGBT cluster. I want to say one last thing, which is the cluster is growing. We are thrilled to be conducting a search this year. The position is going to be open rank, and the three areas of focal interest for this position include diversity and identity, diversity, civil society, and political action, and legal or philosophical frameworks for diverse democracies.
I'm Javon Scott Lewis. I am a cluster hire here in the stead of our cluster chair, Hilary Hoynes, who will be joining us later. I think via pre-recorded message regarding the economic disparities brief responding to rising inequality. I was glad to learn this morning, actually, Rachel informed me that this policy brief is one of the more regularly visited briefs on the HIFIS website. And I mentioned that because it speaks to the integral concern for economic disparities in the everyday experience of everybody, really. And for that reason, I think it's really great that some of our cluster members are involved in other cluster activities, and hopefully we will continue to do further collaboration. However, frankly, this is not enough, right? And the issue is that where policy tends to, I think, really adequately address the lived outcomes of disparities, very seldom do policy briefs speak to the lived experience of economic disparities and disparities more generally. And so for that reason, over the past few years, our cluster has been trying to shift somewhat to really try and engage this question of the lived experience, right? And how that gets done is by thinking really broadly about our disciplinary engagements, right? So at the moment, our cluster is primarily comprised of people from sociology, from public policy, from economics. I think, there is me as the anthropologist, quasi-geographer, African-Americanist. But in order to really attain this goal of fully getting at the lived experience, we need to have further engagement from folks in humanities, for example, right? Because we cannot forget that there is a poetic quality to the difficulties of poverty, right? There are ways in what Clyde Woods called the blues epistemology by which everyday vernacular forms of expressing the experience of poverty get articulated, but very seldom translated, right? And that's, I think, a part of the work that our cluster needs to engage in going forward. And so to that end, I'm really happy to note that last year, the cluster sponsored the Berkeley Black Geographies Project. We had a 3-day or 2.5-day symposium, 5 panels, 35 presenters. The event was attended by over 200 attendees. We have something like 2,000 to 3,000 views on YouTube. And what the days did was, through a question, rather through several questions across 5 panels, we really tried to get at what was the lived experience of anti-Blackness, right? Anti-Blackness as a form of poverty, right? The materialities, but as well as the poetic qualities, in fact, of these experiences, right? Because it's one thing to kind of think about, well, how do we increase income, right? How do we manipulate, say, through tax reform, the ability to save? Nevertheless, we know that even in cases where, say, African Americans do increase their economic prospects, they nevertheless do suffer through intergenerational poverty. Very seldom the increase in economic mobility only lasts a generation. And so these are questions that we have to think about in as comprehensive a way as possible. I'm glad to say that the symposium was a really fantastic opportunity to think about these questions, but most importantly, and I'm very touched by this, it was a way of empowering primarily young women of color on our campus to take the lead in advancing this kind of programming. While I was the faculty kind of coordinator of this symposium, I'm really glad that some of our graduate students in geography and African American studies were able to really spearhead these conversations and are now getting really nationally recognized for having this conversation. We were all really taken by surprise as to how well the Berkeley Black Geographies project was received from a national standpoint. Thankfully, it has given them, I think, the language, the capacity, the ability to think organizationally through the campus apparatus of organization in particular. These young women have now gone on to have received funding from the Social Science Matrix. There will be a follow-up symposium sponsored by the Social Science Matrix next semester. And we are currently editing a volume from the symposium. So the work, this small investment, I think it was $5,000 of the HIFIS Economic Disparities Cluster, has really gone a long way. And so I think the idea for our cluster now is to see how we can think more synergistically, right? To see, okay, well, there's this does great work, right? I'll show it to you properly, right? It does great work, and it's a foundation, right? But there are many ways, right? I think through interpretive social science, through engaging in humanities, that we can begin to, I think, do much more work. And in my own work, I you know, in my writing and in my research, I do what I call the MLK test, right? You know, MLK, stereotypically MLK, anywhere in the United States is a street where you have a predominance of African Americans and poor individuals living. And so in my own writing and my own thinking, I always do what I call the MLK test, which is what I'm writing, is what I'm saying translatable, right? Is it comprehensible, to not on the basis of intelligence, right, but in the capacity for a lived understanding to individuals who might be within that geography. And so I hope that, you know, throughout the broader kind of remit of HIFIS activities, that we do similar tests with ourselves and within our clusters as we begin to do the great work that we've been doing. All right, thank you.
Hi, I'm Karen Nakamura. I'm the chair of the Disability Studies cluster. And I came on relatively recently, and what attracted me to this position was not only the brilliant scholars in disability studies, but the basic concept of HIFIS as a deeply intersectional apparatus that encouraged conversations. And so in my comments today, I want to talk about how we understand disability to be already a deeply intersectional status together with the other cluster activities. So I had asked my colleagues to send me their activities, and of course they send me several pages, and if I read through it all, I would go way over time, and I also apologize if I drop anyone out as I briefly summarize. But so I want to talk about what we've been doing in relation to the concerns of some of the other clusters. So, for example, in terms of religion and disability, one of our scholars, Georgina Klieg, has been working closely with the Contemporary Jewish Museum on a project called Haptic Encounters, which is a reimagination of both Jewish folktales, but also her reapproach of what it means to give access in a museum setting from a blind perspective. And it's part of her larger project of trying to understand what blindness can give to us, to the mainstream in terms of approach. Also in terms of the religious studies aspect, I've been working with the United States National Holocaust Museum in also thinking about eugenics and disability and religion. Because it's a Holocaust museum, primarily around the Nazi experience, but as we know, eugenics both preceded the Nazis and has existed well beyond that as well. We also have deep links with, for example, the LGBT studies cluster, and we're really excited by the trans studies search that Sonia talked about earlier, and Eric Stanley. But throughout that process, you know, part of our interest was understanding, and this is part of my own orientation, understanding trans as also part of how we might reconsider what disability means, and certainly the trans people's experiences with the medical system is in many ways very similar to disabled people's. And so we're really hoping that once Eric comes that we're going to try to recruit him over to disability studies. So that's part of my grand schema. In terms of economic disparities, we've been working, Alistair Isles has been working on a Foodscapes project, which is mapping the campus in terms of food locations, food banks, and so forth. And also Sue Schweik has been working with her students also in writing grants around access to food and food insecurity. And although these don't immediately appear to be disability-oriented, when you think about who has access, what types of access are possible, this is yet another example of when you understand that disability intersects heavily with poverty, that the students who are often unable to get those resources are also going to be disabled students. These things come into more sharper relief. Now, in terms of the democracy, Marcia Saxton has been one of our scholars who's been working heavily on the issue of climate change and disability. And again, this is one of those things where you think climate change and disability, how are those two connected? But again, if you think about the folks who tend to live in low-level areas who are going to be most impacted by rising sea levels, who are going to be most impacted by hurricane-type events. And if you look at even just the most recent one in North Carolina, who are the people who are dying? They're the people in the nursing homes, right? They're the mentally ill who are trapped in the sheriff's van after the police decided to escape and they didn't take their people in custody with them, and so forth. So in many ways, climate change becomes this mechanism by which people become disabled, disabled people become incarcerated, incarcerated people die, and so forth. And it also shifts in terms of climate change is going to cause and has been causing mass migration of people, and also causing disabling events, also leading to disabled people being left out of particular forms of access. In many cases, for example, the US, Canada, and so forth have immigration policies that make it very hard for people who are disabled to be allowed under various statuses. So we see disabled people being dropped out. In terms of education, Sue Shrike ran this incredible conference last year called Academic Ableism, which looked at especially how race gets used in the special education setting to both justify forms of educational violence against particular groups of students, especially African American students. And so we need to rethink about how we provide access, how we think about which students we consider to be disabled, and how the categories of disability and special education. There's another project that she engaged in, which I really liked, which came out of the Asian American experience, which was called Open in Emergency. And this was coming out of a group of Asian American scholars who were thinking about mental health crises, and especially the Asian American stereotype that we don't talk about mental health. And so they had come up with this toolkit, Open in Emergency, that was designed around helping students think about what mental health is and how they might deal with mental health. There's a tarot deck, but the cards of the tarot deck all dealt with different experiences of sort of mental health, identity, what it means to be a community member, and so forth. So that was an amazing event that she organized on campus. And then in terms of health, I was really happy myself to work with Osagi on the Gattaca event that we held celebrating, was it the 20th year of Gattaca? It seems ridiculous, I watched it last week. To talk about genetics, eugenics, gene editing. And this was extremely well attended, both on the showing here as well as the showing in San Francisco by members of both the disability community and the general public. And so we really appreciated that. So we're really excited about all these sort of intersectional efforts that are going on within the disability studies cluster, and really hope that that becomes the hallmark for what we do. Thank you.
So the other thing I wanted to mention is that the briefs represent a unique collaboration, and people that contributed to them may also be in the audience and can also respond to questions during the Q&A. So why don't I begin just welcoming the new people that have joined the panel. The first one is Mahasin Mohajed, and she is a Haas Associate Professor of Diversity and Health Disparities in the School of Public Health, and she's still coming up. Grace Gaudis, she's a graduate student researcher in history, and she worked closely with developing the Religious Diversity Brief. And we already had Janelle from our last panel, and Sonia as well, but Taeku Lee is the former Associate Director of HIFIS, and he's a founding member of the Diversity and Democracy Cluster. He's also a professor of politics and law. And Susan Shrike has joined us, and Susan is Associate Dean of Arts and Humanities. She's a former administrative chair of the Disability Studies Cluster, and she's a professor of English. And Hilary Hoynes is going to join us remotely or by video. She's in London right now. And she is chair of the Economic Diversity Cluster and professor of public policy and economics. So the question for this panel is about the policy briefs. And so the question for each of the panelists is, what would you say are the major takeaways or recommendations from your policy brief that the university and larger community audiences should be aware of. Has everybody got that question? You got it. Okay. Mahasan, are you ready? Or, or do you want someone else to go
No,
first?
it's fine. I apologize. I had to use the restroom, and I already talk really fast, so I didn't want to give my comments while under those conditions, because then you would not understand anything that I said. So just to begin, I just want to say that the brief from our Health Disparities Cluster was a labor of love, spearheaded by Robin Pierce, who's one of our former MPH students at UC Berkeley and now a researcher here. And so she did a lot of work trying to compile the really important work that many people are doing in our Health Disparities Cluster. And then I also just wanted to mention a few of them just to show that we do have representation across many schools, including the School of Public Health, College of Environmental Design and City and Regional Planning. We have College of Natural Resources as well. We have School of Social Welfare. We have anthropology, and so a very diverse cluster across many units on campus. And some of the work highlighted was highlighted from many members of our cluster, including our distinguished chair, Professor Osagi Basji, and then also Julian Chow, who's in social welfare, Professor Jason Corburn in City and Regional Planning, Denise Hurd, work from Rucker Johnson in the Goldman School of Public Policy, also work from myself, I didn't introduce myself, Mahasan Mujahid in the School of Public Health, Rachel Morello-Frosch in the College of Natural Resources as well as in Public Health, and Lonnie Snowden, who's in welfare and public health, and Professor Amani Allen, formerly NeuroJeter, who's also in our School of Public Health. So just wanted to make sure that I highlighted that this is the work of many wonderful scholars. I'd like to start with a quote that we begin our brief with, and the brief is called The Sick Side of Town, which I think is a really great title, How Places Shape Disparities in Health. And we start with this statement. A major misconception about health disparities is that they are a product of inherent differences between groups rather than a function of the unequal distribution of rights and privileges across populations. Poor health outcomes are a result of the myriad of ways that social and political systems are designed to marginalize certain groups by intersections of race, class, and gender or other social attributes. Neighborhoods manifest the differential outcomes of these systems in the quality of their streets and housing, exposure to toxic pollutants, and the presence of protective social networks, among other social and physical characteristics, all of which impact health. Understanding how social and political systems perpetuate social inequality and how social inequities determine disparities will help inform effective structural solutions to close the gaps. So I think this statement really highlights the work that we try to present in the report, and then I'll just talk about some of the takeaways now. Let me just pull up my, sorry. Okay, so the first takeaway is that we start the report using a powerful allegory by Dr. Kamara Jones, who provides a gardener's tale. And this is a tale in which she highlights the story of a gardener who uses her preferences and judgments of the beauty, value, and worth of different color flowers to make explicit decisions about where the flowers were planted, the type of soil they were planted in, and how the flowers were nurtured. And these decisions have a direct impact on the overall health and survival of those flowers. So this allegory really allows us to understand how residential and other spaces where we live, work, and play may shape our overall health and well-being, because some places are filled with rich and fertile soil to help communities and people grow and thrive, and this is what we consider to be the healthy side of town. And other places are filled with poor, rocky, and infertile soil, which is the case for the sick side of town. And so the differential distribution of resources and hazards across places are not naturally occurring, but instead a result of systematic disinvestment of marginalized people living in marginalized places, and these are enforced by state, federal, and local policies, and are often masked behind rhetoric around individual preferences and market forces. So what we highlight is some of the work that's being conducted in our cluster, where we show the kinds of neighborhood factors in relation to the physical and built environment of those neighborhoods, as well as the social context of those neighborhoods, and how they're related to cardiovascular outcomes, related to mental health services, related to asthma-related outcomes, related to differential trajectories over the life course in terms of overall health and mortality, related to birth outcomes, and related to other outcomes highlighted in this report. We also articulate the ways in which environmental hazards by some of the work that Dr. Rachel Morello-Frosch has led, how they vary across places, and how these environmental hazards have to be tackled from an environmental justice perspective. And we also highlight the ways in which racial and economic segregation or inequality are proxies for the systematic disinvestment of neighborhoods and how those also have health consequences. So we make conclusions in the end about how it's important to consider these state, federal, and local policies, and how it's important to work with local governments in particular to really make sure that we're investing in health in all policies. There's a nice example of this, that work that Professor Corburn has done, working with the city of Richmond to include health equity as part of their city's plan, as well as a health in all policies document that they have produced, where they're really outlining their multi-sector approach to addressing health inequities in Richmond. So with that, I'll conclude. Thank you.
Me? Oh, hi everyone. I just want to say thanks everyone for coming, and thanks to HIFIS for making this possible and all the support, financial and otherwise, and to Karen for being our fearless leader and a dream to work with. So, when we were sort of thinking about this brief, we were obviously trying to keep in mind what Dr. Powell was talking about with sort of scholarship and practice, how to integrate those two. And we kept sort of, we were trying to figure out how do we, make this about policy, how do we make this about, sort of law. And we kind of realized that maybe the way for us to sort of use our strengths to make this sort of about scholarship and practice was to make it about teaching. So instead of a policy brief, I think sort of like some of the other policy briefs I've seen, ours is really intended as a teaching document and a teaching resource. So before, hopefully I have time to get to, a couple of our big takeaways about the contemporary religious landscape, and that is in here. But I'm gonna walk through a little bit of what this is, since it's a little bit different. So basically there are 4 parts to this project. First, we wanted to sort of give, Karen's a historical sociologist, I'm in the history department. We thought it was really important to sort of create a narrative of American religious history that would allow teachers, or other interested parties, I guess, but really teachers to, think about American history and think about the material they're teaching to their students in a way that integrates sort of religious history with really important questions of race, immigration, exclusion, belonging, all these sort of themes that keep coming up again and again, and where we were thinking that teachers, increasingly, it's great that there's so much more of a focus on sort of something like race or immigration, but that religion was not necessarily always sort of right there, but it's such an important part of understanding sort of diversity and inclusion and pluralism in America. So we have, sort of a narrative to, how do we think about the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, or how do we think about the Constitution, as an importantly religious event in addition to, all the other ways it's being taught. The second part, and they're not really separate parts right there, sort of next to each other, we have these, if you can see, we have these things we call teaching resources. So once basically, the teacher hopefully maybe will read the narrative, and if they're saying, well, how could I teach this in my classroom? These are ways that we sort of provide resources for them, whether it's primary sources, whether it's media, journalist articles, or lesson plans that already exist, sort of public history resources for those teachers to then bring that to the classroom depending on what they want to do with it. So, some of it might be stuff that they're not teaching now that doesn't make it to, the K-12 textbook, like Mormon migration to Utah, right? And then some of it, they probably are, like Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and, sort of thinking about, MLK and Malcolm X through a religious lens, right? How do you use that sort of more familiar and, in some ways, more familiar historical example to talk about Islam, Christianity, religious framings of, rights, discourses, and politics. So it was really important to us that, again, scholarship and practice, right? That we have this narrative that is really, I was doing my qualifying exam, so I had a lot of scholarship. In my, but that this was also something kind of practical and that, teachers could use it in that way as well. Then sort of, keeping an eye, history is great, and that's a lot of what this is about, but we were also really interested in looking at, okay, so we have this narrative now and we have some materials, how can teachers use this to talk about the current political moment, the current sort of state of religious pluralism, diversity, in light of everything that's happened. So then we have a section on sort of the contemporary landscape is what we call it, with graphs and this kind of thing, and looking at, well, how do we reconcile massive demographic changes, the fact that, compared to 40 years ago, much less of the population is white, Protestant, right? And that things are changing, but then we're also seeing repression and we're also seeing backlash and, understanding sort of polarization at the same time as more people are sort of, different religious identities are coming to the fore. And so it was sort of important for us because, in classrooms, these things come up, right? Once you do the history, students like to talk about current events and teachers do too. And we thought it was really important to sort of, with this, the ideas of sort of the goals of HIFIS in mind, how do we present this information in a way that is sort of neatly packaged, makes sense, but actually says something about inclusion and diversity. And then finally at the back we have some sort of, think pieces, I guess, some sort of shorter pieces by cluster members. Mark Csikszentmihalyi wrote one on Confucianism in America. Heather Haveman from Sociology did one on magazines and Christianity in the 19th century. And Jerome Baggett wrote one on atheism, right? Because one of our big takeaways is that the religiously unaffiliated is like almost 25% of the country now. I mean, it's been this massive change. So how do we think about, atheists or agnostics as part of religious diversity? So it's sort of these ways of sort of thinking about contemporary issues in a more focused way based on sort of contemporary scholarship. And so the last thing I'll say is that basically, we're really excited about this and we really see it as a work in progress. I mean, it's beautiful to hold it, but we definitely see this as something that could live on the web, that we could, cultivate, more of these faculty pieces, add classroom resources, expand the narrative, because it's never good enough when you write something. Ways of making this, more accessible, and then also really working with, people in education and trying to get this into the classroom. We're working with Rachel Reinhardt of the History Social Science Project, which is an organization on campus that works with teachers and educators. So we're really trying, and we're open to any suggestions from anyone, and I hope people will take a minute to look at it, but we're really excited about how this thing could continue to sort of grow and hopefully actually get into the hands of teachers and into classrooms. Thanks so much.
Okay. Hello, good morning again. Thanks for hanging in there, everyone. So again, my name is Janelle Scott. I'm going to talk to you about some of the highlights of our cluster's report, Responding to Educational Inequality. And I should say that sort of the overarching set of assumptions that really are the foundation of the report is that we really see a need to reimagine and re-articulate this concept of the public. We're certainly not satisfied with the status quo in public education in terms of inequality, and yet really see an urgent need to assert a radically just vision for public schooling, particularly when market solutions are being promoted to redress persistent social and educational inequality. And so when we talk about public education, we're talking about democratic, open, accountable, equitable places where children learn and thrive. The authors of the brief that was really led by Naila Nasir, along with one of our excellent former Graduate School of Education doctoral students, Laura Hernandez, who's currently with the Learning Policy Institute. The other authors include Tina Trujillo, Chris Gutierrez, Jabari Mahiri, Zeus Leonardo, and myself. It's focused on K-12 schooling around the understanding that the growing economic inequality that Jovan and others have talked about this morning manifests itself in education policy in a number of core ways. And so what we're seeing in public education is this hyper-segregation of students by race, by income, by language, in increasingly underfunded school districts and schools. This disinvestment has resulted in high rates of teacher turnover and in local policies that we know do not serve children well, who deserve far more and would otherwise thrive. In addition, we find that the sort of universalistic, race-blind approaches often mask the needs of counties, districts, and local schools. And so we argue for a broader understanding of public education as a socio-political space that's affected by these broader social policies in housing, in labor, in health, and environment. But we know that education research also points to ways that we can imagine and realize a far more different, just, and equitable education system for our children in this country. And so I just want to highlight some of those things very quickly. At the state level, we point to research that shows us that when we invest and fund schools equitably and fairly, magical things happen. Children learn, teachers are supported and stay. And yet we know that our current political climate requires us to really look at our states with even greater scrutiny. In this post-Obama era, it calls for a much greater role for the states, for example, in civil rights enforcement and oversight, as we're seeing protections rolled back, the enforcement of education, civil rights for GLBTQ students, and for students who are facing disproportional discipline. And so the states, we think, really need to play an even bigger role than they already did with the current climate in our federal government. In districts, we have research that has identified promising strategies to recruit and retain excellent teachers and leaders who are race-conscious, anti-racist, and content experts. These sort of grow-your-own programs, as they're known, are formed in partnership with graduate schools of education and other spaces at universities, and hold great promise around the question of teacher retention and really having teachers in the classroom who look like the children they're serving. We also know that districts have taken the lead on working on restorative justice practices and the eradication of racial disproportionality in discipline and punishment in schools, which Black and brown children have faced and really robbed them of equitable education. And then finally, within schools and classrooms, research points to the creation and the need and mandate for the creation of detract, culturally relevant and academically engaging and intellectually robust learning environments that brings education alive for children, that honors the cultural context of students and regards them all as brilliant, capable of learning and succeeding. So I'll stop there.
Thanks so much. I'm the chair of the LGBTQ Citizenship Cluster, and I'm really excited to present our brief, which is about the very important issue of restroom access for trans-identified individuals. And just to kind of situate this brief within the larger landscape, this brief, I think, was written at a particularly important time in both the history of Berkeley, but as well as in the United States. I think one of the things that was really motivating the desire to study this issue in greater depth was the recognition that there are sort of two really significant forces that are happening. One is that throughout the United States, a number of transgender plaintiffs have had to file suit against their educational institutions and employers for the often for the decisions that were made to force a transgender identified employee to use the bathroom that corresponds with the identity that they were assigned at birth, as opposed to the identity that they themselves identify with. And so we just were seeing a number of cases of individuals that were denied employment, access to education. And it started that a number of these cases were actually, while initially the trend was against supporting trans plaintiffs, the trend really reversed itself in court. And it was a really exciting kind of set of opportunities. But then state lawmakers across the country began to also get involved. And so the most prominent example of this is the case of HB2, which was the North Carolina statute that required individuals to use restrooms that corresponded with the identity that they were assigned at birth. Again, basically denying access to trans individuals to use the restrooms that most corresponded with their own identities. And so we see this kind of conflict happening where courts are making decisions that are supportive of trans plaintiffs, and state laws are being passed that roll things back. And then our current administration hasn't really helped the situation because immediately after President Trump took office, took a number of positions that basically supported the HB2 line of reasoning, both in the educational context and elsewhere. So we're at a time where there's nothing really, frankly, more urgent than really thinking about who are the most vulnerable members of the LGBTQ cluster. And so it's amidst that this brief kind of came into being. And I just really want to give all credit to Eric Peterson, one of our grad students who wrote this extraordinary set of recommendations, and wrote it integrating the research that had been done within the cluster, but also making a series of really important recommendations. And what it is this brief, in my view, is kind of an example of this powerful intersection between gender, law and civil rights, and architecture, really, focusing on the real world problem of restroom access for trans individuals. And what it does is it really valuably links the issue of bathroom access to the manifestation of this larger set of issues that trans individuals face that is connected to the ability to hold employment or connected to the ability to seek out education, and really does kind of a great job in showing us how these laws that regulate bathroom access are not just kind of discriminatory, they're also distinctly kind of un-American because they disable access to these kinds of, to these other areas of education and employment. So what do Haas scholars specifically kind of offer to bring light on this complex problem? Well, first, what the brief reflects is a very dynamic approach that focuses on the trans population, recognizing the need for a much greater set of empirical research on the plurality of individuals within the trans community. But second, the analysis, I think, also reflects some of the insights that can be gleaned from history, right? It powerfully situates the issue of restroom access against a context that is linked to the history of women entering the workforce, of racial segregation of the disabled. And as much as it also spans those historical contexts, it also situates the issues that are faced by trans individuals amidst a world that pretty sort of obviously lacks a broad array of knowledge on the various needs of different populations beyond the binaries of male and female identity. And so these sort of observations do seem very abstract, but there's actually a very clear set of recommendations that are made at the end, which is to have one gender-neutral single-user facility, one gender-neutral multi-user facility, and then importantly, craft a separate space that is supportive of cisgender and transgender identified women. And the reality behind this suggestion is to take into account kind of a middle ground between binary restrooms and total gender neutrality. And takes into account, I think, the very powerful recommendations that have also been made to really consider some of the reasons for why sex-segregated spaces might be desirable for lactating women and other constituencies. And so in the end, this kind of issue, I think, in many ways, when I think about the importance of this brief, what I think is really significant about it is I think it really captures the complexity that LGBT populations now face in this new era, because it's at a moment where we're facing really significant backlash that actually plays out with respect to issues regarding access to education and access to employment. And so I think that it's important that the brief makes it clear that we've actually seen these issues before and we've dealt with them positively, and that we can deal with this one positively and importantly, move to chart a path towards a more inclusive democracy by creating structures that positively impact transgender individuals' access to education and employment and other important social spaces in the process. So I'm really proud of this brief, and I'm really proud of Eric, and I wish he were here so that we could all thank him for his important work. Thank you.
Well, good morning, and thank you for spending some of your Friday morning with us. I was always raised to give credit where credit is due, and even though John and Denise gave their best effort to try to give credit for these policy briefs to me, I have to say giving credit to me for these policy briefs is like giving Donald Trump credit for the nation's economic growth. It's good that for a lot of people, the country is growing economically, but the credit for it belongs elsewhere. And it is great that these policy briefs are out, and credit for them belongs elsewhere. I think chiefly to Stephen Menendian and to Kia Franklin, also to Rochelle. Yes. Also to Rochelle Galloway Papatas, Punani Forbes for the diversity and democracy brief, to Joshua Clark, and for the other briefs, a team of amazing GSRs. And I have to apologize that I couldn't remember everybody's name, so I will just refer to you as a team of amazing GSRs. John mentioned at the outset that some of these policy briefs are ironically not brief. He was too kind to further add that the professors whose work is highlighted in these briefs are also not very brief. And so 7 minutes is going to be a challenge, but I'm going to do what I can. I think first, I'm going to rely on a crutch, which is to try to find a unifying theme for the three different parts of the brief. And what I thought was the quote that I hear more and more often these days, which is that not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. And that quote is often attributed to Einstein, because anything that you attribute to Einstein sounds more profound when you attribute it to Einstein, but it's more likely from a relatively obscure sociologist named William Bruce Cameron. And the three parts of this brief are first a part about the electorate, about who gets counted and how, and what challenges that raises for the goal of achieving a more inclusive electorate. The second part is about how we can mobilize and activate a more inclusive electorate. And then the third part is about the challenges beyond the realm of elections that the dynamics of the first two part about who gets counted create. On the first part around the electorate, there are two subparts to this first part of the brief. One is on polling. You know, I guess what I would say about polling is, you know, we can't stand them, and we also can't live without them to an extent. They are part of what scholars would call the mediatization of electoral politics. In a way, today, elections don't exist except for what the media covers about them, and that includes the media's interest in horse race coverage of polls. And also, polls and the media coverage around them, in a way, don't exist except for the fact that we have these elections. We follow polling so closely because we think polls tell us something about public opinion, and public opinion is supposed to be the heart of a democracy. But we have to ask every time we see media coverage of a poll, which public and what opinions? On which public, I would just make three very quick polls. One is, you know, when November rolls around, be very careful when you hear reporting about exit polls, because exit polls are very good at telling you about who won generally in an election, but they're very bad at telling us about how particular segments of the electorate voted. In 2016, after Hillary Clinton lost, there was a lot of finger pointing about certain segments of the electorate that failed to show up on election day. And a lot of that finger pointing is based on exit poll data, which I think are not very good at telling us about how African Americans Latinx voters and Asian American voters voted. Second is, every time you see a poll, you have to realize the environment of polling today is such that for every 100 names that a polling firm identifies as people they want to talk to, the polling firm is lucky if they can get 5 people to agree to talk to them. And if those 5 people don't look like the 100 people who don't look like the rest of the United States, then you're getting very skewed information about whose opinions actually count. The third thing I would say about polls is you have to, every time somebody tells you about how this country is changing, you have to keep in mind how this country is changing in the denominator. And what I mean by that I'll just give you an example. You'll hear people talk about the fact that this country is getting a lot more liberal in terms of how it thinks about immigration reform. And you can ask yourself, is that because the country is getting more progressive on immigration reform, or is it because there are actually more immigrants, more Latinx, more Asian Americans, more Afro-Caribbeans that are actually in the mix when we are conducting polls today? How about on opinions? On opinions, I just briefly say, we have to ask, are polls actually asking the questions that we care about, or are they setting an agenda for our politics in the questions that they choose to ask? And for instance, I do a lot of work on public opinion, and I have not seen since 2016 a lot of polling on questions, if any, on questions like, what do we think about Dodd-Frank and financial regulation? What do we think about all the deregulation that is happening in general in this country? What do we think about the Paris Agreement and what the country should do on climate change? What do we think about voter fraud, voter ID laws, and about the gerrymandering and redistricting cases that are happening in North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Alabama, and so on? In a way, in terms of actual politics, these are the things that have actually been happening that really shape our politics. And instead, what we get is a steady diet of what the country thinks about the job that Donald Trump is doing, which is, instead of the dog wagging the tail, this is the tail wagging the dog. There's a second subcategory on the first section of this brief, which is about the ways in which we can't take the categories, the demographic categories that people talk about in an election as though they exist out there in the world. They're actually things that are made as a result of a political process. Christina Mora's work on making Hispanics is a brilliant example of this, where she shows that through a lot of dynamics between activists and advocates, mass media, business interests, and government officials, the category of Hispanic got made. There is nothing that was foregone about the fact that we refer to a certain population, subpopulation in this country as Hispanics. Michael Omi and Chris Cepeda Milan also do a lot of work in this area, and the work is really important as we think about heading into the 2020 census. There's a really important fight that may happen, that needs to happen, about how we will count ourselves as a country in 2020. I'm on the Census Bureau's National Advisory Committee, and I can say there's a lot of excellent research, expensive research that has gone into recommending changes to how we think about the race and ethnicity question, the proposal to add a new category of Middle East, North Africa, and instead what we're going to get for political reasons having to do with the Trump administration is a new question on citizenship and a breakout of white ethnicity so that whiteness can be categorized into different ethnic groups. That's a political choice, and in democracy, it's a political choice that we ought to have a voice about. The second aspect of this the brief touches on is the current political construction of a new category, which is the category of white working class. And this is also a political construction. In previous election cycles, people talked about blue dogs, they talked about soccer moms. If you're old enough like me, they talked about Macomb County Democrats. And as I understand it, I would just highlight two things that I think are important to keep in mind about the current construction of white working class. One is to remind ourselves about something that Frederick Douglass put very powerfully, which is power concedes nothing without a demand. If there's no struggle, there's no progress. And I think if anybody thought previous to the 2016 election that a group in the United States that has, for the history of the United States, held a monopoly, a chokehold on power, privilege, and resources, which are white Americans, if anybody thought that a group like that would peacefully and willingly cede their chokehold on power, privilege, and resources, then there's a weak understanding of history. That doesn't happen. And so a lot of what we're seeing in the political construction of white working class is that struggle. When 2043 rolls around, this year that everybody is waiting for with bated breath, because that's supposedly the year when the country becomes majority minority, there's no magic that's going to happen. When that clock turns, the country will be 49.9999% white. And so there's nothing particular that's going to happen in terms of the reallocation of power, privileges, and resources just because of demographic change. White working class, what it is, what it can be, what that category can ally with politically, is a political construction, which means we have a say in what happens. If you can imagine what white working class might look like under a President Bernie Sanders, that would be very different from the current political construction of white working class. Okay, I think I'm taking longer than I should. The second key section of this policy brief is about mobilization and voter engagement. And this section really highlights some incredibly important work that Lisa Garcia-Bedoya has been doing, which is conducting field experiments to really know what works in terms of getting the vote out, getting people registered. And the best way to summarize that is to say mobilization works best when it's personalized. And by personalized, I mean three things. If it's engagement with a human interface, so having somebody knock on your door or hearing a real live voice on the telephone is much, much more effective than getting something in the mail or hearing a robocall. Personalized also means when it's engagement that is tailored to you as an individual. For example, having somebody talk to you who is of the same gender, same religion, same race or ethnicity, someone who you go to church with, somebody who's a neighbor in your community, that's a lot more effective. And finally, personalized engagement is engagement that's unscripted, that emphasizes your personal story as opposed to somebody else's agenda for what matters in a particular election. These findings are super important, especially as we're heading into these midterm elections, and I encourage you to look at the policy brief to see some truly scary numbers about how much voter turnout drops off in the midterm elections and for whom voter turnout drops off the most. I'll just give you one small piece of that. If you look at young voters, already in presidential election, 18 to 29-year-olds don't turn out to vote, right? So 40% of 18 to 29-year-olds turn out to vote in any given presidential year. In midterms, it's only 16% in 2014. And this election clearly is about them as much as it is about any of the rest of us. I'm going to skip a couple of sections and just turn quickly to saying a few things about the third and final section of this brief, which is about what's happening on the daily in terms of diversity and democracy beyond elections. And this section highlights, I think, two important areas. One is Ian Haney Lopez's work on dog whistle politics, which is about racially coded appeals, rhetorical winks and nods that tell certain groups, hey, I'm with you. And then for everybody else, the fact that these appeals are coded gives them cover, gives them plausible deniability. And behind every practitioner of dog whistle politics, I would say there's a small army of enablers as well who then step up and say, well, actually, so-and-so is not racist. They're actually, a good person and so on. And in 2016, we've seen how, dog whistle politics has essentially been replaced by a bullhorn. No one is explicitly saying, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, but there's a lot of bullhorning going on in this country with tiki torches. The last section of the brief is about the phenomena of fake news beliefs in American politics today. And I think this is some of my own work, and even for a political scientist who's pretty cynical, it's truly scary. Only 20% of the American public say they trust the information that they see in mainstream media. And in the research that I've done, that single belief that you don't trust what's in mainstream media shapes your politics far and beyond just who you choose to vote for president. belief in fake news today appears to be as strong, if not stronger, than anything else political scientists like me have used to predict how people think about policies. It is a phenomenon that is with us, and it's a phenomenon that's incredibly important. I had more to say about that, but I'll just close by saying, to the title of the brief, Realizing a More Inclusive Electorate, I would say rather than summarize policy recommendations, I would just close to say the goal, realizing a more inclusive electorate, has never been more important and perhaps also never been more difficult. Thank you.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Sue Schweig from the Disability Studies Cluster, and the policy brief I'm going to talk about came out of work that I started doing a few years ago because I wanted to foreground and do everything possible to further the work of one of the co-authors of this brief, Ella Callow, who's a lawyer and who I am very happy to say has just accepted the position as the ADA coordinator for this campus. This brief exists because of the work of Lucy Seriani, who's right over there. Lucy, can you wave? Or who's a graduate student in the English department and also an activist around these issues herself. I know that everyone in this room, or I believe this, has heard and thought about the issue of separation of children from their parents in recent months in the context of Trump's zero-tolerance policy and the terrible things that have been happening to children and parents. And we've heard child psychologists make the point again and again and again that it's in the best interest of children to stay in their parents, with their parents, except in situations of clear and present danger. The Supreme Court has ruled repeatedly that parents' right to the care and custody of their children is protected under the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. But I want to start by talking about another very different Supreme Court ruling that has never been overturned and that bears on the topic that we wrote about. In 1927, Carrie Buck, who was 21 years old, was sterilized against her will, and her right to parent her already born daughter, Vivian, was terminated. And why did that happen? It was because she was designated, I'm using scare quotes, feeble-minded. She was the first person to be sterilized under legislation modeled by the U.S. eugenicist Harry Laughlin, who contended that, quote, the basis of designation for sterilization is inferior potential parenthood. The Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of the state of Virginia's sterilization of Carrie Buck in the famous case Buck v. Bell. And over the course of the 20th century, at least 60,000 people in this country were forcibly sterilized, most of them poor, most of them people of color, and some of them as young as 10 years old. This year, not quite 100 years later, after Carrie Buck's sterilization, which, by the way, that law has never been overturned, another disabled woman gave birth to another baby girl, Tammy Duckworth, double amputee and senator. And on the surface, Tammy Duckworth's experience could not be more different than Carrie Bell's. So we might think of this as a great narrative of progress and triumph, but many disabled people today have experiences of parenthood that are more like Carrie Buck's than Tammy Duckworth's. Because here's the point of our brief. In 2018, the notion of inferior potential parenthood still undergirds U.S. family and child welfare law. It serves as the justification for 33 state laws, including our own states, that allow for the severing of constitutionally protected parent-child relationships because of a parent's status as disabled. According to the National Council of Disabilities 2012 report that our co-author Ella Callow played a major role in producing, parents with psychiatric disabilities have their parental rights terminated 70 to 80% of the time. Parents with intellectual disabilities 40 to 60% of the time. And deaf, blind, and physically disabled communities report elevated child welfare involvement and a very well-justified fear of the child welfare system. Now, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 prohibits publicly funded entities from discriminating on the basis of disability, and yet, all these years later, 2/3 of states in the U.S. continue to adhere to legislation that lists disability as grounds for termination of parental rights. And by that I mean disability in and of itself, absent any evidence of neglect or abuse. Disability alone. And the majority of states also sanction legalized discrimination in the realm of family court proceedings, adoption law, and assisted reproductive technology provision. It's really important to note that the national percentages of parents identified as disabled, identified or identifying, are higher in populations massively overrepresented in child welfare systems, that is, American Indian or Native Alaskan parents and African American parents. Studies we discuss in the report have shown that parental disability doesn't negatively affect children's development, and there's evidence that it may in fact have a positive impact. Laws discriminating against the right of disabled people to raise children are simply rooted in prejudice. And it's a very deeply rooted prejudice. I'm sure there are people in the room who are already thinking that it's counterintuitive, but read our brief. We are sure that the best remedy for the current legal situation of parents with disabilities will take place at the state level. We have already heard a little bit of discussion about why a fix at the federal level, however elegant it would be, is not happening. And we urgently need to stop the separation of families that's happening today. We want to see states that haven't yet done so, and especially the 33 that actually list disability as grounds for termination of parental rights, to enact legislation based on the model state legislation proposed by the National Council on Disabilities Rocking the Cradle report. Some states have successfully done that. A few states have good laws, but we think every state law has to be better yet. And here's one example. No law in any state addresses the fact that parental mental illness is one of the few bases on which the hard-won protections of the Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978 are circumvented, often by state court systems. Given the vast overrepresentation of Native American children in the child welfare system, we think it's crucial that a clear statement that the Indian Child Welfare Act applies with equal vigor where parents have disabilities of any type should be included in any kind of remedial legislation at the state level. Legislation should be comprehensive in nature. It should encompass all kinds of disability. It should apply to dependency law, family law, adoption law. It should incorporate protections against the continuing reliance on pseudoscientific measures like IQ and personality tests for parents with intellectual and psychiatric disabilities. Those aren't reasonable, sensible, appropriate ways to measure whether a parent can handle taking care of a child. It should be drafted in consultation with experts, both in disability law and also experts who are people with lived experience of parenting while disabled, who can make clear the kind of creative, practical techniques that they've developed. And in the final section of the report, we focus on other innovations needed in state practice beyond legislation that can support parents with disabilities, all parents, and their supporters. And I'll just say one more thing. We really have high hopes that we might be able to roll this out, as we say, with and through Tammy Duckworth. And so we're working on that. Ella Callow talks about how parenting in some ways is to the disability movement what marriage, same-sex marriage, was for LGBTQ. Just a very public and graspable symbol of equality that proceeds on terms that are understood by all people in this country. And so we think that a state-by-state model, much like the movement for same-sex marriage, using model legislation and rolling it state-by-state is the way to go. Thanks.
Hi, good morning. I'm Hillary Hoynes. I'm the chair of the Economic Disparities Cluster as part of the Haas Institute. And I'm sorry that I wasn't able to be with you today, but I'm really happy that I'm able to at least talk to you about our exciting policy brief and video. So I know you had a chance to talk earlier with my co-cluster head, Jovan Lewis, and so he told you a little bit about what we're working on in the cluster. But today I want to talk to you about our policy brief that we released a few years ago. So in fact, the Economic Disparities Group, I think, was the first Haas Institute group to release a policy brief. And John Powell and I had the opportunity to go to Washington, D.C. to launch our brief and to speak to some policymakers and their staffers on Capitol Hill. So we had a lot of fun, and I think it was a great opportunity to show the Haas Institute in Washington, D.C. So the title of our policy brief is, as I look down at my notes, Responding to Rising Inequality, Policy Interventions to Ensure Opportunity for All. And this was a really collaborative effort across many members of the Economic Disparities Cluster that are working on this issue from different perspectives here on the UC Berkeley campus. And as many of you know, Berkeley is really a place of incredible leadership and excellence in the context of studying economic inequality. And our policy brief starts by sort of defining the problem, as we say in the policy school. So providing important descriptive statistics and context around stagnating wages, rising income and wealth inequality, and other important aspects of documenting these measures of inequality. And then we spend a good chunk of the policy brief talking about different policy solutions that are advanced by many scholars here on campus in their work, including policies like minimum wages, tax credits like the Earned Income Tax Credit, kind of human capital kinds of interventions such as early childhood education, increasing school funding, and importantly, integration of public schools. And of course, we end in the policy brief with talking about fundamental tax reform as another mechanism to affect inequality. So I hope you have a great event today. Again, I'm sorry that I can't be here, and I look forward to seeing you all sometime soon. Thanks so much.
Anyway, so our first question is for Teku, and it's regarding your comment that only 20% of people believe in the truth of mainstream media. How has that changed through time, and what factors are contributing to that change?
Thanks for the question. I'm not sure where to look, but you know, I think it's part of a growing trend of increasing polarization, increasing distrust, declining confidence in a lot of important social institutions in the United States. So if you step back and think about why in this particular moment is the United States a country in which it's so easy to propagate conspiracy theories about what's actually going on out there, and why it is so prevalent for people to think that they can't trust what's in the mainstream media. I think part of that is due to the fact that a lot of key social institutions that we've relied on to essentially keep it together have themselves suffered a lot of, crises that make them much weaker in American society today. And by that, I don't just mean political parties. I think political parties are a big part of it. But if you look at the role of the press, if you look at the role of religious institutions, if you look at the role of business themselves, I mean, we used to have a lot of businesses that had a sense of social responsibility that's different from what we have today. And I would also, implicate universities. I think a lot of universities used to own a public mission that was much more untethered to the business case for universities, which seems to dominate. To your specific question, I only know of a few data points. So I think if you asked Americans about 10 years ago whether or not they trusted what was in mainstream media, it would be closer to the high 20s. So it wasn't that high even a decade ago. If you look at the more general trend on confidence in public institutions, There's been a very steady decline in confidence in the media from about a majority of the country, I would say about 2 to 3 decades ago, down to where we are now, about 20%. And the best thing that could be said about that is it's not as bad as the even steeper decline in confidence that Americans have for essentially the people's branch of government, which is Congress. If you ask about confidence in Congress, that in the 1970s was up around 50%, and today it's down last year at 7%, which is almost the margin of error for the poll itself. So you almost can't say it's not zero.
Thank you, Teku. And now we have a question for Grace and Karen, where the question is, where are shining examples of positive, diverse, pluralistic religious spaces, and how are they maintained?
So is this a question about the brief or more general? I want to know because the answers would be different, whoever asked the question.
General.
General? Okay, so if it is general, then I think I could be the one who answers it, because my own work is actually on the sharing of sacred sites between Jews, Christians, and Muslims in the Mediterranean, both historically and in contemporary cases. Today, actually, around the world, just for Jews, Muslims, and Christians, and here I'm not talking about Muslims and Hindus in India and other places. There are lots of other examples, but just for the Abrahamic religions, there are probably more than 100 cases of shared spaces where either the two religions, Jews and Muslims and Christians, or the three together use shrines, synagogues, and all kinds of spaces to pray together, to cohabit, to accommodate to each other's otherness, and to find ways of actually creating community. And I do both historical and ethnographic work on that, as well as exhibition projects on that. Then other examples are actually the city, for example, of Marseille, which is a case that I'm starting to study as a good example of pluralism, is a place where Muslim immigrants and the French local population have figured out, both because of the structure of the city and the politics of the city and this kind of accommodation that has happened over time and the economy. Actually, the way in which the local economy developed made it possible for Marseille, for example, to be the case of an urban space that didn't have the riots, that didn't have all of the explosions of the early 2000s in France. When Paris exploded, Lyon exploded, I don't know if you remember, there was a lot of racial and ethnic and religious hatred and upsetness that came out. Marseille remained completely calm. So that gave me the idea to look at Marseille as a case study. There are people who work on Mumbai as another case study. So there are pockets, and I think what we need to play in this religious diversity and pluralism issue, I'm starting to think more and more that we have to look at these cases, whether historical again or contemporary, of what works, where it works, what works, and look deeply at how people are managing diversity at the local. What are they doing? Sharing is not easy. We know it from kids in their playground that they don't share easily. It never gets better, in my opinion. And we need to actually figure out what are the mechanisms, what are the ways in which people do that, and then promote those. Think of them in a more macro situation, and that's what I think the work of the cluster is about as well. And certainly that's what I have dedicated the rest of whatever years of my career to. So. And in the American context,
Well, I would
race
just add that one thing we found too with the brief, and this is sort of the very micro level, but one thing that we found really striking, and I don't know if I call it a shining example of religious pluralism, but you know, as of, I don't have the year here, but as of like the last couple of years, Pew found that 21% of Americans were born in an interfaith household. So like fully 1/5, whether that means two religiously affiliated parents, one yes, one no. I know, you know, my mom was Protestant, my dad's Jewish, right? I mean, it's a very common story. And so I think that that's another sort of more micro, and I don't know if I would call it, you know, oh, it's so inspiring, but it does show that within households there's pluralism and within people's families even. So it's sort of operating on all these levels.
Great. Thank you very much. So a question for Mahasan. Can you talk about strategies for how to operationalize the health in all policies approach?
So yeah, I think first thing to note is that health in all policies is very difficult, particularly when you think about bringing together sectors that already have constrained budgets, challenges, and responsibilities, you know, transportation, education, you know, health, and sort of health departments, et cetera, and to sort of tell all of those sectors that health has to now be your priority as well. And so I think from the jump, it's very challenging because what it's arguing is that transportation has to think about the unintended health consequences of decisions that are made in the transportation sector, and education has to think about the unintended health consequences of decisions that are made in relation to educational policy, et cetera. And so I think, you know, part of the challenge of that is being able to create space to come together, to have sort of a multi-sectoral sort of meeting and time and space and energy to support the cross-fertilization of ideas and to create shared language and shared commitment around sort of this idea that health can actually improve, you know, sort of all aspects of what they're doing in these different sectors. And I think that the Richmond model is really a nice model because it was actually written into the city's plan. And so you had a kind of a different kind of investment in health and all policies where it was mandated and sort of there's surveillance around the effectiveness of thinking sort of in integrated spaces across sectors about how we can sort of improve the overall health of Richmond by making decisions in unison in relation to these different sectors. And so I think that's one nice model that other cities are now starting to follow for examples of how health and all policy works. And so you can see resources and documents and reports on the City of Richmond's website. And so that's a really nice model to use as an example.
Great, thank you, Mahasan. So for this disability and or education, what is the impact of the growth of charter schools on outcomes for students with disabilities, particularly in underserved communities? So maybe both of you could comment.
Did you want to take it first, Sue?
Yeah, not a very well-informed comment. Karen, do you want to comment? What I would say is from a disability lens, it's clear that failure to provide accommodation and segregation is an effect of charter schools. And I'll say it that with that blanket. It doesn't mean, and I'm leaving aside any other issue about charter schools, but it doesn't mean that given a system of charter schools that couldn't theoretically be different, but the barriers are very high. And because charter schools have the ability to select, it's very easy for charter school administrators to say, you know, the services your kid needs, your kid should just go to that big school over there that's not called a charter school. And as long as the services are being provided somewhere, it's not against the law. And so this means that a system develops where there is access to goods for certain kinds of children and not for others. So disabled children of color, disabled poor children, which is a whole lot of them, however well a charter school might be serving a generalized category of their children, or those children, or might be argued to be serving them. I would say from my perspective, it's extremely likely that that is being done, among other ways, by siphoning off disabled children and re-segregating them.
Thank you for taking that first. I think one thing to add to those important observations is to think about the policy context in which charter schools are situated. And so one of the policy trade-offs on which charter schools were based was this idea that with greater freedom, you would have greater accountability and produce greater outcomes. And so it does create this perfect storm then if for many schools to think about how to make sure their accountability numbers look good enough to be reauthorized, look good enough for funders to support their institutions. And so, and then we have a state policy context in which the regulatory frameworks are not robust enough, right, to deal with the kind of individual decision making. And so in the context of students with disabilities, one of the things we've seen in charter schools in California, but charter schools across the nation, is certainly an under-enrollment of students who qualify for services and supports. But I think there's something even more granular going on, is that with what we've seen with charter schools who do serve students, special education students, that the severity of their disabilities are much less so than what we find in traditional public schools. And so there's also kind of a parting moment, and many of these kids are being served in traditional public schools that are really constrained in terms of resources. And so it has created a competitive environment and an inequality environment that I think our states and districts and counties are not up to dealing with in ways that would really benefit children.
Thank you both for those responses. And now this question is directed to any panelist, and so maybe a panelist that hasn't spoken might address it. How do you bring your research to advocates and organizers working on your issue and involving them in participatory research?
Okay, I guess I'll try to respond. I think that, as some of you may know, some of my work focuses on gender and sexuality, and some of it also focuses on technology and civil rights. And so as a member of the LGBTQ citizenship cluster, I'm kind of acutely aware of how issues of identity actually play out in issues of technology and design. And so in all of the work that I've done, and I should say that building intersections between them has been a little bit of a challenge, but as things happen in society, we see a lot of different ways in which you can connect issues of gender and sexuality to issues of technology. And one of the big projects that I worked on in the past was on Section 377. That was the sodomy law that was in India that was recently overturned. And in a substantial amount of the research I did, I spent a fair bit of time talking to activists and individuals in India. And part of that really informed some of the early research that I did on sexual orientation, kind of discussing how notions of sexual orientation play out differently across different cultures and within different communities. And this is something that I think, at the time that I started this research, which was now almost 20 years ago, it was part of a conversation that was only just starting to happen. And it's been really lovely to see all of the different ways in which those insights have been made by many other people and in lots of other contexts. And I guess now thinking about the complexity of issues of gender identity and sexuality, I think that it's important, in fact necessary, for all of the research that we do within the cluster to engage individuals that are being directly targeted by policies that that in many ways do not include their best interests at heart. And so, I think that in general, part of the fun of being a lawyer is you get to kind of look at a lot of different populations in creating policy and thinking about how to create better and inclusive strategies. And in order for that to be useful, necessary, and effective, it has to engage the work of activists on the ground who are seeing the direct result of these policies.
Great, thank you, Sonia. Other people want to respond
Can I
to?
just say really quickly, and I know I've already spoken, but some of that work is between individuals, scholars, and particular organizations. Some of it, I think, has to be institutional, so this is a little bit of shameless self-promotion, but I've been working with Professor Lisa Garcia-Bedoya, who's here, and Professor Hari Han, who's at UC Santa Barbara, to essentially create what we're calling the Center for Democratic Organizing, and it is an effort to explicitly build partnerships from the ground up, starting with the way that we train graduate students to do their research in partnership with organizations that are doing the on-the-ground organizing work. And so the idea is to start, at least initially, with a summer institute where we partner promising graduate students with the leaders of organizations like SEIU, Color of Change, Sierra Club, and so on, to think about what would be research that would be meaningful for them to enhance their strategic capacity to do their work. So, and there's more I could say about that, but I think some of it is at individual level and some of it really requires building up things that can go beyond the efforts and initiative of particular individuals.
Did any other panelists want to respond to that question? Were you going to say something, Jovan?
Sure. Is this, yeah, okay. So I think, one of the key issues is thinking about the directional flow of our research into the community, as well as how we can bring the community into the university, right? I think there's a great deal of us who go out, we do research clearly, right? And we have a kind of presence and a place in the communities that we work in, but very seldom do those communities have a chance to come and be represented in the university space. So again, I guess a little bit of a plug. So Ananya, Roy, and I at UCLA, as well as a few other faculty at various UC campuses, recently put in for a multi-research fund application for funding for a project called Critical Race Praxis, reimagining the public university. And a part of all of our respective campus projects, was a creation of a public scholars program, right, where we either have activists such as at UCLA, or we have, so for example, in the Bay Area, I was, requesting that we find someone who, in fact, does public scholarship, perhaps not under, through the auspices of the university, right, but in fact, everyday engagement and knowing the community in a way and bringing that individual as a recognized legible resource into the university, which in fact in turn shapes or reshapes the university landscape as far as what kinds of questions, what kinds of epistemologies are recognized as being valid and capable of informing our proper discourse, right, as scholars, as our, individuals who produce scholarship that are meant to have impact. So I think that's really one of the primary mechanisms is by, in fact, really trying to rupture the boundary of the university and the community and making a more porous kind of capacity for discursive discussion. And I think, for my mind, at least, to my mind, that is, I think, the most powerful possibility.
Denise, can I say something?
Of course.
I'm just thinking it was very deliberate in our policy brief that it was co-authored by someone who was not a faculty member or a graduate student in this university. That was a choice. And one thing I really love about our disability studies cluster is that a number of the people who are the cluster members are not academic senate faculty members, because I think that's another important way of thinking about who's out there. And there are part-time teachers on this campus, for instance, who are working in major, incredibly influential national organizations in the Bay Area. And I really value their presence within HIFAS.
Thanks very much. So here, our next question is for Janelle, and is, it's stated, because school funding is tied to property taxes, how do we disrupt the cycle of, I can't read that. How do we disrupt that kind of funding and change the funding formula in California?
Thanks for that little question. I'll just. I mean, California, the story of California public education is quite tragic, right? Because we, pre-Prop 13, we're the envy of the country. And so, I mean, I can't solve that. We have to repeal Prop 13. But I think the kind of incremental steps that are being taken in California around the local control funding formula, which redistributes the little funding we do allocate for K-12 schooling according to need from the state level. So that's one, I think, attempt, right, to direct resources to the districts that need it most. As yet, I think the research is still unsettled about the effects of that. It's unclear, for example, how districts are spending their additional revenue, and if we think about the fact that the base aid is so low already and not enough, in many ways, these additional resources are not able to allow districts to do what they might otherwise want to do, and instead are really filling stopgaps from the lack of money. I think the other thing that are California, but are in other states where you have this low base aid from the state, it's created a situation layered upon all the things I talked about and others have talked about. So we have hypersegregation, right? We have inequality, and so many schools have their own separate foundations or nonprofits that raise money for their local school. I'm complicit in that. My kid's school does that, right? And that's all off the books. That's not being reported as part of our public allocations. That usually it's a PTA or a local school foundation, and so we've sort of privatized our state and local aid, and really I think it just circles back to this idea that we really need to reimagine what we care about in our public spaces and fund them as such, and that's going to take more than some wonky ed policy researcher to do. That's going to take a broad-based social movement, and these movements are afoot. I know the California teachers unions and other labor unions, for example, are trying to call for, the campaign is called 20 by 20, and so the idea that we would increase our state funding $20,000 per child by 2020. There are movements like that to really redirect the gaze on what Prop 13 has done to decimate our public institutions and really the kind of public vision for K-12 schooling in the state.
Okay, thank you very much, Janelle. The next question is for Teku. And it is, weaponized social media is also personalized to play upon our fears. How do we combat this?
I think Janelle is very good at taking big questions. Well, I mean, I think
Facebook a public utility.
I think in the several decades history of the emergence of ICTs and information communication technologies, I think we've gone from having a really Pollyannish view of what access to nearly ubiquitous information and full transparency over the generation of that information would do for democratic politics to understanding that it's a technology, and as a technology it can be used for good or for devastating ends, and we're seeing a lot of a mirror on problems in society that get amplified, accelerated, and weaponized using these ICTs, such as the ways in which a lot of social media really function as echo chambers that deepen divisions. I think they're a harbor for things like nativism, racism, sexism, and hate. That seems to travel much more rapidly than a lot of the emancipatory projects that we imagined out of social media. But, I think we're only a couple of decades into it, so it's possible that people are thinking about regulation in ways that they haven't before. People are taking much more of a, I think, proactive view towards their relationship to social media. And so I think the optimist in me thinks that this is a necessary evolution in our relationship to this new technology, and that something better might be in our future.
Great. Thank you so much. And I have one last question that I'll ask, and it's for I guess it's for the Disability and Education Cluster to respond to. And someone is asking, are there plans for collaboration between the education and disability clusters?
Yes, sort of. I mean, I think our ideal has always been for the HIFIS initiative to have more cross-cluster collaboration. So I just want to say that on the outset, and I think some of these things happen quite naturally and organically across cluster member interest and energy, and some of them become a little more sort of forced. And so we just submitted a proposal to study special education services in charter schools that we would be drawing from the insights and expertise of folks affiliated with the disability cluster. But as yet, we just turned it in. Thanks you, Puanani, again for all you did for that. So I think that's one way that's future looking. But I think more generally, the opportunity to collaborate between ed and disability, but between all of us, that potential is still really unmet and untapped, even though I think we've done some really important and incredible work in a university that is still not ready for interdisciplinary cross-collaborative work. I'm really proud of the kinds of collaborations we've all been able to foster, and I think it's really meant the world to me personally in terms of feeling really at home at the university. So.
Yeah, thank you, Janelle, and I'd say that we had in one of our Research to Impact talks, Karen challenged us to think about what's the relationship between disability and African American studies. And so I think we, are always thinking about ways in which we need to collaborate more. And we do plan a lot of things. In fact, one of the things I wanted to announce is that we have a family separation event coming up. That's a collaboration between our health disparities and our, I think, diversity and democracy clusters. So, we're all focused on this issue of equity and inclusion, and there's so many overlaps, and there's so much intersectionality, as you've heard, so that is part of our vision that we're unfolding. Karen?
If I can ask Sue to make a quick comment on the Chancellor's strategic plan and actions there.
Yeah, I will. I'm so excited by both the family separation and by the news about that grant, and struck by the, and this is said truly without any blame, it's the first anyone in disability studies is hearing about it. I think it's really easy to forget disability. In the strategic plan, there is one mention of disability in the entire plan. We have just produced a document, we combed through the plan. It's in the section on student services. It's very aspirational. It's a wonderful statement about going beyond simple compliance with the law. But that's it in the entire plan. There's no mention in anything that has to do with planning for buildings and facilities. There's no mention in the strategic initiative that involves inequity and opportunity. There's no mention of disabled faculty, staff, postdocs, visitors. It's just really still really easy to forget this issue. So I recommend anyone who's interested, we'd be glad to send you our report on the strategic plan. And just to emphasize, this is an issue that affects every person in this room, every person on this campus. This is a universal issue. We all have bodies, they're vulnerable, they get older, and it's just a really good thing to do to keep it in mind. And anyway, I'll stop.
Well, thank you very much. Are there any other questions or comments?
I had a question. Some of the panelists were looking at different aspects of education and particularly inequality within those spheres. And you talked a lot about charter schools and public schools. And I was wondering, in your research and in your data, did you come across anything around independent schools, particularly in the PK through 12 range?
So I'm familiar with some of the research, but what do you what are you thinking? Are you thinking about independent privates or independent alternative schools within the, because there's a broad range institutionally. So
Independent private school.
So, I mean, there is some literature on them and their affordances and their limitations, right? You know, so their limitations is that they're private, so they're tuition-based. They do have some scholarships for families that can't meet the tuition requirements. But there's also, you know, evidence about some of the affordances, right? They tend to be small. Their ethos is a progressive one around pedagogy and inclusiveness. And so there are some, I think, important aspects to them. They're a very small subset of the overall private school sector. By, you know, the largest sector, or the largest aspect of the institutional sector, private schools are religious schools, right? So they account for a very small subset of the private school population. Families that go to them tend to report being very satisfied with them in terms of how their children are learning or being served. So I think that at a very general level, that's sort of how I would sum up the literature on them. I think there are things that sort of traditional public school districts maybe could stand to learn from them, but there's a question of scale, right, and a question of selectivity that sort of confounds those lessons. So.
All right, thank you. Well, at this time, what I'd like to do is thank our wonderful panelists, and let's give them a hand. And thank all of you for coming out and making this a really wonderful event. And you'll be hearing from HIFAS about more activities. As I said, we're kicking off a year of democracy starting now. And now we will adjourn to lunch, where you'll get a chance to talk informally with panelists. And so thank you again, and enjoy great food.